Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might completely shatter your romantic notions about the Golden Age of Piracy. Forget the swashbuckling adventures and buried treasure. We're talking about the mind-numbing reality of eating rock-hard biscuits full of weevils, sitting through democratic meetings where pirates voted on everything from their captain to their dinner menu, and getting your legs sawed off by a drunk barber with no anesthetic except rum. This is the pirate life that Hollywood doesn't show you, the one where scurvy was a bigger threat than the Royal Navy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Have you ever wondered what pirates actually did between raids? Spoiler alert, it was mostly trying not to die from malnutrition. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because we're about to discover that being a pirate was less yo-ho-ho and a bottle of rum and more. Please God, let us find fresh water before we all die of dysentery. We'll explore the fascinating democracy that governed pirate ships, where captains could be voted out mid-voyage, and we'll meet the ship's surgeon, who was usually just whoever owned the saw. Part 1, the pirate's pantry, a culinary nightmare. The popular image of pirates feasting on exotic foods plundered from merchant ships is about as accurate as the idea that they all had parrots and wooden legs. The reality of pirate cuisine was a monotonous, nauseating cycle of preserved meat, rock-hard bread, and whatever they could catch or steal before it rotted in the tropical heat. A pirate's diet wasn't just bad. It was a constant battle against starvation, disease, and food so disgusting that even rats sometimes refused to eat it. Let's start with the foundation of maritime cuisine in the Golden Age of Piracy: salt pork. This wasn't the bacon you're imagining. This was fatty pork belly, packed in so much salt that it had the texture and taste of leather, soaked in seawater. The preservation process involved layering pork in barrels with enough salt to kill anything living, then sealing it for months or even years. The process of preparing salt pork for consumption was a ritual of disappointment. First, the cook would extract a piece from the barrel, often having to chip away at it with a knife because the salt had formed a concrete-like crust. Then it would be soaked in precious fresh water when available to leach out some of the salt. Even after soaking, the meat was so salty that eating it without dilution would cause severe dehydration. It was usually boiled in water with whatever else was available, creating a greasy, salty soup that pirates grimly called sea soup or salt horse. The quality of salt pork degraded over time in ways that would horrify modern food safety inspectors. After months at sea, the fat would turn rancid, developing a smell that seasoned sailors described as somewhere between death and low tide. The meat itself would become increasingly tough and develop a rainbow sheen of bacterial growth. Maggots were common, and pirates would often have to pick them out before cooking. Some crews actually preferred slightly maggoty meat, claiming the larvae added protein and improved the texture. But salt pork was a luxury compared to the other staple of pirate cuisine, hardtack. Also called ship's biscuit, sea biscuit, or by various unprintable names, hardtack was essentially flour and water baked into a disc so hard it could allegedly stop a musket ball. These weren't crackers or cookies. They were edible building materials that required strategy and sometimes tools to consume. The production of hardtack was an exercise in removing everything that makes bread enjoyable. No yeast, no salt, no fat, Just flour and water baked multiple times until every molecule of moisture was gone. The result was a disc about 4 inches across and half an inch thick that could last for years without spoiling, mainly because there was nothing in it to spoil. It was less food and more of a caloric storage device. Eating hardtack required technique and patience. The traditional method was to soak it in water, rum, or the grease from cooked salt pork until it softened enough to chew. This could take anywhere from minutes to hours, depending on the age of the biscuit. Veterans would tap their hardtack on the table before eating to knock out the weevils, small beetles that inevitably infested the biscuits. The saying, "shut your eyes and eat it," originated from sailors trying not to see what was crawling in their food. The weevil situation deserves special attention because it was such a defining feature of maritime life. These small beetles and their larvae didn't just occasionally appear in food, they were essentially a food group unto themselves. After a few months at sea, hardtack would be more weevil than biscuit, leading to the darkly humorous maritime tradition of calling them bargemen, because they helped transport the biscuit to your stomach. Pirates developed various strategies for dealing with weevils. Some would break their hardtack into water and skim off the weevils that floated to the top. Others would wait until dark to eat, reasoning that what they couldn't see couldn't disgust them. The most pragmatic simply considered weevils as extra protein and ate them along with everything else. In fact, heavily infested hardtack was sometimes preferred because the weevils' tunneling made the biscuits easier to break and supposedly improved the taste. The psychological impact of constantly eating infested food shouldn't be underestimated. New pirates often couldn't keep food down for their first weeks at sea, not from seasickness, but from disgust. Veterans would mock them mercilessly, making a show of eating particularly wormy biscuits with apparent relish. This hazing served a purpose. Those who couldn't overcome their squeamishness about food wouldn't survive long at sea. Ship's cooks developed creative ways to make weevily hardtack more palatable. Skilligalee was hardtack soaked in water and fried in pork grease. Dandyfunk was crushed hardtack mixed with molasses and rum, then baked into a sort of pudding. Lobscouse combined hardtack, salt meat, and whatever vegetables were available into a stew. These dishes didn't eliminate the weevils, but at least disguised them among other ingredients. The weevil problem extended beyond hardtack to virtually all dry goods. Flour, rice, peas, and beans all became infested over time. Pirates would often find their morning porridge moving on its own, or discover that their pea soup had more larvae than peas. The only foods safe from weevils were those too salty, too alcoholic, or too rotten for even insects to consume. Scurvy, the pirate's curse. If bad food was the daily misery of pirate life, scurvy was the slow-motion death sentence that haunted every long voyage. This vitamin C deficiency disease killed more pirates than battles. It was so common that pirates considered it just another occupational hazard, like drowning or being hanged. The progression of scurvy was a horrible descent into physical dissolution. It started subtly fatigue, irritability, and joint pain that could be attributed to the hard life at sea. Then came the more obvious symptoms: gums that swelled and bled, teeth that loosened and fell out, and breath so foul that sufferers were isolated from their crewmates. Old wounds would reopen, healed fractures would break again, and the skin would develop purple spots that spread like bruises from invisible blows. In advanced stages, scurvy became grotesque. The victim's legs would swell with fluid. Their skin would split open at the slightest touch, and they would bleed from their eyes, nose, and even hair follicles. The final stages brought delirium, convulsions, and death. The entire process, from first symptoms to death, typically took 3 to 4 months, a slow, agonizing decline that everyone on board could watch happening. Pirates knew that fresh food, particularly citrus fruits and vegetables, could cure scurvy, but they rarely had access to either. The connection between citrus and scurvy prevention wasn't scientifically understood, and many captains considered fresh food an unnecessary expense. Even when pirates captured ships carrying oranges or lemons, the fruit would only last days in the tropical heat before rotting. Some pirate crews developed their own scurvy remedies, most of which were useless or actively harmful. Drinking seawater was a common cure that only hastened death through dehydration. Eating rats was thought to help because the rats seemed immune to scurvy. They produced their own vitamin C. Some desperate crews would put ashore on uninhabited islands and eat grass, bark, or anything green in hopes of curing their affliction. The social impact of scurvy on ship dynamics was profound. As crew members weakened, the workload on healthy sailors increased, leading to resentment and sometimes abandonment of the sick. Pirates with scurvy were often left at the next port, given a small share of plunder if they were lucky, or simply thrown overboard if the crew was particularly ruthless. Fresh water stored in wooden barrels would turn green with algae within weeks, develop a thick scum of bacteria, and breed mosquito larvae in tropical climates. After a month at sea, ship's water was typically described as thick enough to chew and tasting of sulfur and corruption. The barrel storage system itself was problematic. Wooden casks would leak, especially in rough seas, losing precious water to the bilge. The wood would impart flavors ranging from merely unpleasant to actively toxic, depending on what the barrel had previously contained. Barrels that had held wine or rum were prized for water storage, while those that had contained tar, turpentine, or other naval stores could poison an entire crew. Pirates developed various methods to make bad water drinkable. Adding alcohol was the most common solution, not for pleasure, but for survival. The alcohol helped kill some bacteria and masked the taste of decay. Grog, the mixture of water and rum, that became synonymous with naval life, was invented not as a recreational drink, but as a public health measure. The standard ratio was 4 parts water to 1 part rum, just enough alcohol to make the water safer, without incapacitating the crew. Collecting rainwater was a constant obsession during tropical voyages. Every piece of canvas that could be spared would be rigged to channel rain into barrels. During storms, the entire crew would work to collect water, often standing naked in the rain with their mouths open, drinking directly from the sky. These moments of abundance were celebrated like victories in battle. The politics of water distribution caused more conflicts than almost any other issue on pirate ships. Officers typically received better quality water from newer barrels, while common sailors got the dregs. During shortages, water rations could drop to less than a pint per day in tropical heat where men needed gallons to stay healthy. Stealing water was one of the few crimes that could result in immediate execution on a pirate ship. The occasional feast. Despite the general misery of their diet, pirates did occasionally eat well, usually immediately after capturing a merchant vessel. These feasts were legendary affairs that could last for days, with pirates gorging themselves on fresh foods they hadn't seen in months. Pirates would immediately slaughter and cook these animals, knowing that keeping them alive required water and food the crew couldn't spare. The result would be a massive barbecue on deck, with every man eating meat until they were sick. Fresh bread from a recently captured ship was treated like gold. Pirates would eat entire loaves in one sitting, their shrunken stomachs rebelling against the sudden abundance. Butter, cheese, and eggs were consumed with an urgency born from knowing they would spoil within days. Fresh vegetables were often eaten raw, pirates gnawing on cabbages and carrots like apples, desperate for the vitamins their bodies craved. These feasts had a dark side. pirates' bodies, adapted to starvation rations, would revolt against sudden plenty. Mass diarrhea was common after capturing a food-rich prize, with the entire crews simultaneously sick from overeating. Some pirates actually died from refeeding syndrome, their malnourished bodies unable to process the sudden influx of nutrients. Alcohol was usually abundant after a successful raid, and pirates would drink with the same desperate excess they applied to eating. Entire crews would be incapacitated for days, drinking captured wine, brandy, and rum until the supplies were exhausted or they were too sick to continue. These binges served a purpose beyond pleasure. They were a form of wealth consumption, turning plunder into immediate gratification rather than trying to preserve it. The distribution of captured food followed the democratic principles that govern pirate ships. Everything was divided according to the ship's articles, with officers getting slightly larger shares, but everyone receiving something. A pirate who tried to hide food for himself faced severe punishment, possibly marooning. This equal distribution meant that feast and famine were shared experiences that bonded the crew together. Fishing and foraging. Between the misery of ship's provisions and the occasional windfall of captured supplies, pirates supplemented their diet through fishing and foraging, with mixed and sometimes dangerous results. Fishing from a pirate ship was complicated by the vessel's speed and the need to remain mobile. Trailing lines would slow the ship, and stopping to fish made them vulnerable to navy. Still, pirates fished when they could, using simple handlines with hooks made from bent nails or carved bone. The catch was usually small fish that were eaten immediately, bones and all, for the calcium. Larger fish presented their own problems. Sharks were common in tropical waters and would often take hooked fish before they could be hauled aboard. When sharks were caught, they were eaten, despite their strong ammonia taste and tough meat. Every part was used: the liver for oil, the skin for sandpaper, the teeth for trade or decoration. Some crews considered shark meat bad luck, but hunger usually overcame superstition. Sea turtles were the ultimate prize for pirates in the Caribbean. These massive creatures provided hundreds of pounds of meat and could be kept alive on deck for weeks by regularly dousing them with seawater. Turtle soup became so associated with maritime life that it remained a delicacy long after the Golden Age of Piracy ended. The eggs were especially prized, eaten raw or cooked into a kind of custard. Foraging on uninhabited islands was a desperate gamble. Pirates had no reliable knowledge of which plants were edible, leading to frequent poisonings. Manchineel trees, common in the Caribbean, produced fruit that looked like small apples but were violently toxic. Many crews learned through fatal trial and error which plants to avoid. Coconuts were the safest forage food, providing both water and calories. Pirates would load their ships with hundreds of coconuts when they found them, the nuts lasting weeks without spoiling. The problem was accessing them. Climbing palm trees required skill and strength that malnourished pirates often lacked. Falls from palm trees killed or crippled many desperate foragers. Birds and their eggs provided occasional protein. Pirates would raid nesting colonies, gathering eggs by the thousand when they found them. The eggs would be preserved in salt or pickled in vinegar, lasting weeks if properly prepared. Seabirds were caught with lines and hooks or knocked from their roosts at night. The meat was invariably tough and fishy, but pirates couldn't afford to be choosy. While merchant and naval ships operated under strict autocratic hierarchies, pirate ships were floating republics where major decisions were voted on. Captains could be deposed at will, and every crew member had a voice in the ship's governance. This wasn't idealistic egalitarianism. It was pragmatic organization by men who had rejected traditional authority and needed alternative ways to maintain order. The foundation of pirate democracy was the ship's articles, also called the Pirate Code. These weren't the mythical guidelines of movie fame, but serious legal documents that every crew member signed or marked. The articles governed everything from the division of plunder to compensation for injuries, from daily rum rations to the punishment for desertion. They were the constitution of the floating republic, and violating them could result in marooning or death. Each pirate crew wrote their own articles, though most followed similar patterns. The Articles of Bartholomew Roberts' crew, one of the few complete sets that survive, provide a window into pirate self-governance. They included 11 articles covering everything from the equal distribution of food to the prohibition of women and boys aboard ship. They specified that lights must be out by 8 o'clock, that musicians had Sundays off, and that every man had a vote in affairs of moment. The democratic process began before a ship even left port. The crew would elect their captain through open vote, usually choosing the most experienced navigator or the boldest fighter. But unlike naval captains who held absolute authority, pirate captains were more like CEOs hired by the board. They could be voted out at any time for cowardice, cruelty, or incompetence. Many captains were deposed mid-voyage, sometimes multiple times on a single journey. The captain's authority was surprisingly limited. During battle, his word was law. Quick decisions needed to be made without debate. But in all other matters, he was just another vote. Route planning, target selection, and the decision to fight or flee were all subject to crew vote. The captain typically received only 1.5 to 2 shares of plunder, compared to a common sailor's single share, a modest premium for what was often a thankless job. The quartermaster was arguably more powerful than the captain in daily operations. Elected separately by the crew, the quartermaster represented the common sailor's interests, distributed provisions, mediated disputes, and led boarding parties. He was the check on the captain's power, and many successful pirate ships were essentially run by captain-quartermaster partnerships that balanced each other's authority. The distribution of booty was the most important aspect of pirate democracy and the source of endless debate and regulation. The articles specified exactly how plunder would be divided, with shares calculated down to the smallest denomination. This wasn't rough equality. It was precise, mathematical fairness that would make modern unions envious. The basic principle was that everyone who participated in taking a prize received a share. The captain typically got 2 shares. The quartermaster, surgeon, and master gunner got 1.5 shares, and other officers got 1.25 shares. Common sailors got 1 share each. This meant that the highest paid person on a pirate ship earned only twice what the lowest earned. Compare this to merchant ships, where captains might earn 10 times a sailor's wage. But the share system was more complex than simple ratios. Before any division, the ship's common fund was replenished. This covered repairs, provisions, bribes, and compensation for the injured. Only after these collective needs were met was the remaining plunder divided. This ensured the ship remained seaworthy and the crew remained fed, preventing short-term greed from destroying long-term viability. Special bonuses were awarded for exceptional service. The first man to spot a prize received an extra reward, as did the first to board an enemy vessel. Musicians who played during battle to maintain morale got additional compensation. These incentives encouraged vigilance and bravery, while maintaining the basic egalitarian structure. The actual division of plunder was a complex ritual. Everything was brought to the main deck and displayed. The quartermaster would oversee the sorting and valuation, with crew members able to challenge assessments. Items that couldn't be divided, like jewelry or navigation instruments, were auctioned among the crew with the proceeds divided according to shares. This transparency prevented officers from skimming and ensured everyone knew exactly what they were getting. Disputes over division were handled democratically. The crew would vote on contested items or valuations, with the majority decision being final. Pirates who felt cheated could appeal to These proceedings were taken seriously. Fair distribution of plunder was the glue that held pirate crews together. The pirate court system. Pirates developed sophisticated legal systems for handling disputes and crimes within their floating societies. These weren't kangaroo courts, but structured proceedings with established procedures, rights for the accused, and proportional punishments. The pirate justice system was often fairer than the naval courts they had fled. Minor disputes were handled by the quartermaster acting as magistrate. He would hear both sides, consult the articles, and render judgment. Common issues included theft. Ironically, stealing from fellow pirates was strictly forbidden, fighting below decks, and negligence in duties. Punishments for minor offenses included loss of shares, extra duties, or temporary reduction in rum rations. Serious crimes required a jury of peers. The accused could select jury members from the crew, present witnesses, and argue their own defense. The jury would deliberate and vote, with a majority decision determining guilt. This system gave common sailors more legal rights than they would have had in civilian courts, where they would be judged by their social superiors. The range of punishments was creative and pragmatic. Moses's law, 39 lashes, was common for serious but non-capital offenses. Marooning on a deserted island with minimal supplies was reserved for the worst crimes like murder or rape of crew members. Sometimes, the marooned man was given a pistol with a single shot, a grim mercy allowing suicide rather than slow death from starvation. Sweating was a punishment for laziness or cowardice. The offender was forced to run around the mainmast while crew members prodded him with swords, continuing until he collapsed. Woolding involved tying a rope around the offender's head and tightening it with a stick, causing excruciating headaches. These punishments were designed to be memorable but not permanently disabling. The crew couldn't afford to lose able-bodied sailors. The appeals process was surprisingly robust. A condemned man could request a retrial with new evidence or appeal to the entire crew to overturn a jury's decision. Captains could pardon. This separation of powers prevented any individual from becoming too powerful. The economics of pirate democracy. The democratic structure of pirate ships wasn't just about fairness, it was economically efficient. By aligning everyone's interests through equal shares and collective decision-making, pirate crews avoided many of the principal agent problems that plagued merchant vessels. On merchant ships, sailors had no incentive to fight hard or take risks. They received fixed wages regardless of the voyage's success. Officers might embezzle or make decisions that benefited themselves at the crew's expense. The vast wealth disparities created resentment that manifested as laziness, desertion, or outright mutiny. Pirate democracy solved these problems. Every crew member was effectively a shareholder in the enterprise, motivated to maximize profits and minimize costs. The democratic selection of officers ensured competent leadership. Incompetent captains were quickly replaced. The transparent division of plunder prevented embezzlement. The result was crews that fought harder, sailed more efficiently, and stayed together longer than their merchant counterparts. The insurance system pirates developed was remarkably sophisticated. The articles specified compensation for injuries sustained in battle, typically 600 pieces of 8 for a lost limb, 100 for an eye, with proportional payments for lesser injuries. This proto-insurance system meant pirates would take calculated risks, knowing they would be compensated if injured. It also prevented injured pirates from becoming burdens, as they received enough compensation to retire or start new lives. Pirates also developed credit systems for members who needed advances against future plunder. A sailor might borrow to buy better weapons or clothing, paying back the loan from his next share. Interest rates were regulated by the articles, preventing predatory lending. This credit access meant even the poorest sailor could properly equip himself, benefiting the entire crew. The democratic structure also facilitated better information flow. On naval ships, valuable intelligence might never reach decision-makers because of rigid hierarchies. On pirate ships, any crew member could propose targets based on information they had gathered. This, women and pirate democracy. The role of women in pirate society is complex and often misunderstood. While the stereotypical pirate crew was exclusively male, the reality was more nuanced, with women participating in pirate democracy in various ways, though rarely as equals. Most pirate articles explicitly banned women from ships, but this was more about preventing conflict than misogyny. The reasoning was pragmatic. Women aboard ship led to jealousy and fighting that could destroy crew cohesion. The articles of Bartholomew Roberts stated that bringing a woman aboard in disguise was punishable by death, showing how seriously this prohibition was taken. Yet women did serve on pirate ships, sometimes openly. Anne Bonny and Mary Red, the most famous female pirates, served on Calico Jack Rackham's ship with the crew's knowledge and consent. They dressed as men during battles, but lived openly as women at other times. Their presence required special amendments to the ship's articles and the crew's explicit vote of acceptance. Female pirates who disguised themselves as men could participate fully in ship democracy. Mary Red served for years as Mark Red, voting in crew decisions and receiving an equal share of plunder. When her gender was discovered, the crew voted on whether she could continue serving. The fact that they voted yes suggests that competence mattered more than gender to practical pirates. Women also participated in pirate economy from shore. Pirate wives and lovers often fenced stolen goods, gathered intelligence, and managed pirates' finances while they were at sea. Some ran taverns that served as unofficial pirate headquarters, where crews were recruited and plans were made. These women had no official vote in ship decisions, but wielded considerable informal influence. The punishment for raping women was severe in pirate articles, usually death. This wasn't from progressive gender politics, but practical necessity. Rape would bring the full force of colonial. Pirates who attacked women risked not just execution, but the loss of safe harbors and local support networks. The limits of pirate democracy. While remarkably progressive for its time, pirate democracy had significant limitations. It was democracy for the crew only. Captured sailors were often forced into service, and enslaved Africans freed from slave ships weren't always given equal status. The democratic ideal coexisted uncomfortably with the violent reality of piracy. Forced recruits, called pressed men, occupied a liminal status. They couldn't vote initially, and received smaller shares of plunder. Only after proving themselves in battle or demonstrating loyalty could they become full crew members with voting rights. This probationary period could last months or years, creating a two-tier system within the supposedly egalitarian structure. The treatment of African sailors was inconsistent. Some pirate crews welcomed escaped slaves as full members, appreciating their sailing skills and hatred of colonial authorities. Others maintained racial hierarchies, giving African crew members smaller shares or no voting rights. The famous pirate Black Caesar served as a lieutenant to Blackbeard, showing that some Africans achieved high positions, but this was exceptional rather than typical. Democracy could also be suspended during emergencies. The articles usually included clauses allowing the captain to assume dictatorial powers during storms or battles. Some captains abused these clauses, extending emergency authority beyond legitimate crises. Crews had to balance the need for quick decision-making with preventing autocratic overreach. The democratic process could be inefficient. Important decisions sometimes took days of debate, with ships drifting aimlessly while the crew argued. Some crews split apart when they couldn't reach consensus, with factions taking different ships and going separate ways. The freedom to leave meant that unpopular decisions could literally break up the crew. Mob rule was another danger. Popular but incompetent leaders might be elected, or skilled but unpopular officers voted out. Charismatic speakers could sway crews to make foolish decisions. The execution of prisoners sometimes became grotesque popularity contests, with crew members trying to outdo each other in cruelty to gain respect. If there was one person on a pirate ship who was simultaneously indispensable and completely unqualified for their job, it was the ship's surgeon. In a profession where violent injury was routine and tropical diseases were constant, medical care meant the difference between life and death. Yet most pirate surgeons had no formal medical training, learning their trade through desperate improvisation and fatal trial and error. The typical pirate surgeon wasn't a physician who chose a life of crime, but rather whoever on the crew had the steadiest hands and strongest stomach. Often, this was the ship's carpenter, already skilled with saws and used to precise work. Sometimes, it was a captured surgeon forced into service, or a barber who had some experience with bloodletting and tooth extraction. The democratically elected nature of most ship positions meant that surgeons were often chosen by crews who had no idea what medical competence looked like. The surgeon's quarters, grandly called the cockpit on larger ships, or simply the surgery on smaller ones, was usually below the waterline where the motion was less severe. During battle, this became a chamber of horrors. Tables were cleared for operating surfaces, buckets placed to catch blood, and saws and knives laid out like instruments of torture. The walls would be lined with wounded men waiting their turn, listening to the screams of those being operated on without anesthetic. The medical equipment available to pirate surgeons was primitive and often improvised. A typical surgeon's chest might contain bone saws for amputations, various knives and scalpels often repurposed from other tools, needles and thread for suturing, sometimes sailmakers' equipment, cauterizing irons that were heated in the galley fire, bullet extractors that looked like medieval torture devices, and tourniquets made from leather straps or rope. Medicine was equally basic. Rum served as both anesthetic and antiseptic. Laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, was precious when available. Mercury was used for treating syphilis, though it caused as many problems as it solved. Tar was applied to wounds as a sealant. Gunpowder was sometimes mixed with rum and ignited on wounds to cauterize them, a treatment that killed as many as it saved through shock. Without antibiotics, any serious wound to a limb would likely become infected, and infection meant death. The solution was to remove the limb before gangrene set in. Speed was essential, not just to minimize pain, but because shock would kill the patient if the operation took too long. A skilled surgeon could remove a leg below the knee in under 3 minutes. The amputation process. The process of amputation on a pirate ship was a brutal race against time and shock. When a man was brought to the surgery with a shattered limb, the surgeon had to make quick decisions that would determine whether the patient lived or died. First came the assessment. The surgeon would examine the wound, looking for bone fragments, checking blood flow, and determining where to cut. The general rule was to amputate at the joint above the injury. A wound to the hand meant losing the forearm. A wound to the foot meant losing the leg below the knee. This gave the best chance of getting above any infection while leaving enough stump for a prosthetic. Preparation was minimal. The patient would be given as much rum as he could drink, sometimes mixed with gunpowder, which was believed to provide courage. Leather straps or strong men would hold him down. A leather gag or bullet would be placed between his teeth to prevent him from biting his tongue off. The tourniquet would be applied above the amputation site, twisted tight with a stick until blood flow stopped. The cutting began with the skin and muscle. The surgeon would make a circular incision, cutting down to the bone, while an assistant pulled the flesh back to expose as much bone as possible. This was the most painful part, and many patients passed out from shock. Those who remained conscious would scream so loudly that drummers were sometimes ordered to play during operations to drown out the sound. The bone saw came next. Using a carpenter's saw that had been hopefully cleaned, the surgeon would cut through the bone as quickly as possible. The sound, a grinding, splintering noise, was said to be worse than the screams. Bone chips would fly, blood would spray despite the tourniquet, and the assistant would have to hold the limb steady to prevent the saw from binding. The surgeon had to tie off the major arteries before releasing the tourniquet, or the patient would bleed to death in minutes. Using silk thread or horsehair, he would ligate the vessels, a delicate process made nearly impossible by blood-slicked fingers and poor lighting. Missing even one major vessel meant death. Sealing the stump was the final step. Some surgeons used hot tar, painting it over the wound to create a seal. Others preferred cauterization with hot irons, searing the flesh shut. The most progressive surgeons would create a flap of skin to fold over the stump, suturing it closed in a technique that wouldn't become standard for another century. Post-operative care was almost non-existent. The patient would be moved to a hammock and given rum for pain. The stump would be wrapped in whatever cloth was available, changed infrequently due to supply limitations. Infection was almost inevitable. If the patient survived the first 3 days without developing fever, they had a chance. Most didn't. Disease and pestilence. While battle injuries were dramatic, disease killed far more pirates than combat ever did. Tropical diseases, nutritional deficiencies, and infectious diseases spread through crews like wildfire, turning ships into floating plague houses. Yellow fever was the most feared tropical disease. Called yellow jack, or the black vomit for its characteristic symptoms, it could kill half a crew in weeks. The disease started with fever and headaches, progressed to jaundice, hence yellow fever, and ended with victims vomiting black blood before dying. There was no treatment except prayer and rum, neither particularly effective. Malaria was endemic in the Caribbean, brought by sailors who had been infected on shore. The cyclical fevers, chills, and delirium could incapacitate entire crews. Some pirates learned the Jesuits' bark containing quinine could help, but it was expensive and rarely available. Most sufferers simply endured the cycles of fever, hoping their body would eventually overcome the parasite. Dysentery, called the bloody flux, was a constant presence on ships with poor sanitation. The combination of contaminated water, spoiled food, and close quarters meant that intestinal diseases spread rapidly. Men would be reduced to skeletal wrecks, spending their days in the surgeon could do nothing except recommend boiled rice water, which was rarely available. Syphilis and other venereal diseases were occupational hazards for pirates, who spent their shore leave in brothels. The standard treatment was mercury, administered as an ointment, pill, or vapor, The saying "a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury" reflected both the source of infection and the long, painful treatment. Mercury poisoning often killed patients before syphilis did, causing tooth loss, neurological damage, and kidney failure. Typhus, spread by lice in the close quarters of ship life, could devastate a crew. Called ship fever or jail fever, it caused high fever, delirium, and a characteristic rash. Entire ships would be found drifting with every crew member dead or dying from typhus. The only prevention was maintaining cleanliness, nearly impossible on a pirate ship. The surgeon's approach to these diseases was largely palliative. Bloodletting was the universal treatment, based on the belief that disease was caused by corrupted blood. Purging through vomiting, or diarrhea, was induced with various toxic substances. Blistering, creating burns on the skin to draw out disease, was common. These treatments weakened already sick patients, turning survivable illnesses into death sentences. Dental nightmares. Dental care on pirate ships was perhaps even more primitive than general surgery. With diets high in sugar from rum and low in vitamins, pirates suffered from rampant tooth decay and gum disease. The ship's surgeon, with no dental training, was expected to handle everything from toothaches to obsessed jaws. Tooth extraction was the only treatment for decay or infection. Using tools that were often improvised from ship equipment, pliers, metal hooks, even modified eating utensils, the surgeon would attempt to pull diseased teeth. Without understanding of dental anatomy, they would often break teeth, leaving roots embedded in the jaw to become infected. The extraction process was agonizing. The patient would be held down while the surgeon gripped the tooth with pliers and twisted, pulled, and yanked until it came free. If the tooth broke, which was common with decayed teeth, the surgeon would have to dig out the fragments with picks or knives. Jaw fractures were common from the force required. The surgeon would lance the abscess with a knife, draining the pus while the patient was held down. If the infection had spread to the jawbone, the surgeon might attempt to scrape away diseased bone with a chisel, a procedure that almost always resulted in death from shock or subsequent infection. Some pirates attempted preventive dental care with varying success. Chewing tobacco was thought to prevent decay, though it actually caused gum disease. Rinsing with urine for its ammonia content was another folk remedy. Some crews captured European dentists and forced them to provide care, though these professionals were rarely better than the ship's surgeon. The social impact of dental problems was significant. Pirates with missing teeth had difficulty eating hardtack and salt meat, leading to malnutrition. Speech impediments from missing teeth affected authority and communication. The constant pain from dental disease could drive men to suicide or madness. One pirate chronicler noted that toothache had caused more desertions than the Royal Navy, tropical ailments, and remedies. The Caribbean's tropical environment presented unique medical challenges that European pirates were completely unprepared for. Diseases unknown in temperate climates thrived in the heat and humidity, while familiar ailments took on new, more virulent forms. Fungal infections were ubiquitous in the tropical moisture. Deck rot, or sailor's foot, athlete's foot, could progress from minor irritation to crippling infection. In severe cases, the skin would slough off entirely, leaving raw flesh exposed. The surgeon's treatment was to apply tar or turpentine to the affected areas, causing excruciating pain but sometimes preventing further spread. Parasites were another constant threat. Hookworms, acquired by walking barefoot, would burrow into the skin and migrate to the intestines, causing severe anemia. Guinea worms, contracted from contaminated water, would grow under the skin for months before emerging as yard-long worms that had to be slowly wound out on sticks over weeks. Botflies laid eggs that developed into larvae under the skin, requiring surgical removal. Heat stroke could kill within hours, with victims experiencing delirium, convulsions, and organ failure. The surgeon's treatment Bloodletting and cold water immersion often hastened death. Pirates learned to adapt by working during cooler hours and staying hydrated, though freshwater shortages made this difficult. Poisonous creatures posed constant danger. Sea urchin spines, stingray barbs, and jellyfish stings required immediate treatment. The surgeon would try to extract spines and barbs, often breaking them off under the skin where they would fester. Portuguese man-o'-war stings were treated with urine or vinegar, both ineffective. Some surgeons learned from indigenous peoples that certain plant saps could neutralize venom, but this knowledge was rare. The tropics also affected wound healing. Cuts that would heal quickly in Europe became chronic tropical ulcers in the Caribbean. These ulcers would grow larger over time, eating away flesh down to the bone. Maggots often infested these wounds, though some surgeons noticed that maggot-infested wounds actually healed better. The maggots ate dead tissue, preventing gangrene. Sunburn and sun poisoning were serious medical issues for fair-skinned European pirates. Severe sunburn could cause blistering, fever, and delirium. The surgeon would apply various ointments, aloe when available, tar when not. Chronic sun exposure led to skin cancers that would eat away at faces and hands, though these were usually attributed to tropical miasma rather than sun damage. Mental health at sea. The psychological toll of pirate life was enormous, though mental illness was poorly understood and rarely treated as a medical condition. The surgeon was expected to deal with madness alongside physical ailments, using methods that ranged from the ineffective to the cruel. Calenture was a form of delirium specific to sailors in tropical waters. Sufferers would hallucinate that the sea was actually green fields and would try to jump overboard to walk through them. The condition was probably a combination of heat stroke, dehydration, and psychological stress. Treatment involved restraining the patient and forcing them to drink water, though many jumped to their deaths before they could be stopped. The isolation, constant danger, poor nutrition, and guilt from violent acts created perfect conditions for mental illness. Surgeons might prescribe alcohol, making things worse, bloodletting weakening the patient, or simply isolating the sufferer until they either recovered or threw themselves overboard. Post-traumatic stress from battle and violence was common but completely unrecognized as a medical condition. Pirates who had survived horrific battles, seen friends dismembered, or participated in torture might experience nightmares, flashbacks, and violent outbursts. These men were considered cowards or troublemakers, rather than trauma victims needing treatment. Alcohol dependency was perhaps the most common mental health issue. With rum freely available and few other escapes from the harsh reality of pirate life, many pirates were functional alcoholics. Delirium tremens from alcohol withdrawal during shortages could cause hallucinations, seizures, and death. The surgeon's solution was usually to provide more alcohol, perpetuating the cycle. Some surgeons recognized connections between physical and mental health. They noticed that men with scurvy became depressed, that fever caused delirium, and that certain herbs affected mood. But without any framework for understanding mental illness, treatments remained primitive. Restraints, isolation, and punishment were the primary tools for managing psychological problems. Indigenous medicine and pirate adaptation. One of the few medical advantages pirates had over naval surgeons was their willingness to learn from indigenous peoples and African slaves. While official medicine rejected savage treatments, desperate pirates would try anything that might work. From the Taino and other Caribbean peoples, pirates learned about medicinal plants unknown to European medicine. Guava leaves could treat diarrhea. Papaya seeds expelled intestinal worms. Tobacco leaves, when applied to wounds, had antiseptic properties. These remedies were often more effective than European treatments, though pirates rarely understood why they worked. Africans understood inoculation against smallpox centuries before Europeans, using a technique of introducing small amounts of infected material to create immunity. Some pirate crews with African members practiced this, achieving better survival rates during smallpox outbreaks. The use of cannabis and other psychoactive plants for pain management was learned from both indigenous and African sources. While European medicine relied on alcohol and occasionally opium, pirates had access to a wider pharmacopoeia. Cannabis was used for everything from pain relief to treating glaucoma, though its psychoactive effects meant it was often used recreationally as well. Surgical techniques were also shared across cultures. Some African cultures practiced sophisticated wound suturing using ant heads as clips. The ant would bite the wound edges together, then its body would be twisted off, leaving the head as a suture. Pirates observed and occasionally adopted these techniques when conventional supplies ran out. The exchange wasn't one-directional. Pirates introduced European medical knowledge to isolated communities, creating a hybrid medical practice that combined the worst and best of multiple traditions. A pirate surgeon might use African herbal remedies, indigenous surgical techniques, and European amputation saws all in treating a single patient. The ship's medicine chest. The medicine chest was one of the most valuable items on a pirate ship, often worth more than chests of gold to a crew facing disease. These chests were usually captured from merchant or naval vessels, as pirates rarely had resources to stock their own medical supplies. A well-stocked medicine chest might contain laudanum for pain, mercury for syphilis, ipecacuanha for inducing vomiting, bark quinine for fevers, sulfur for skin conditions, and various herbs and tinctures whose effects were more hoped for than proven. But pirate medicine chests were usually far from well-stocked. Most contained whatever random medicines had been accumulated through raids, often expired, mislabeled, or of unknown purpose. Officers didn't automatically receive better treatment than common sailors. The articles might specify that medicine be distributed based on severity of illness rather than rank, though in practice valuable crew members like navigators often received preferential treatment. Storage of medicines in tropical conditions was problematic. Heat and humidity destroyed many preparations. Glass bottles broke in rough seas. Rats and insects contaminated supplies. The surgeon had to be creative in preservation, using wax seals, storing medicines in the coolest part of the ship, and sometimes mixing expired medicines together, hoping for some remaining potency. When medicines ran out, surgeons turned to improvisation. Gunpowder mixed with rum became a cure-all. Seawater was used for everything from wound cleaning to enemas. Tar, readily available for ship maintenance, was applied to any external ailment. These substitutes were usually ineffective and often harmful, but they provided the psychological benefit of doing something rather than nothing. The economics of pirate medicine. Medical care created unique economic dynamics on pirate ships. The surgeon, despite often being incompetent, was one of the highest paid crew members because of the essential nature of his services. Some articles specified that surgeons received 1 1/4 to 1 1/2 shares of plunder, plus first choice of medical supplies from captured ships. The compensation system for injuries, specified in the articles, created interesting incentives. Since specific payments were guaranteed for specific injuries, 600 pieces of 8 for a leg, 500 for an arm, 100 for an eye. Some pirates allegedly deliberately injured themselves when capture seemed imminent, ensuring they would receive compensation, even if imprisoned. Medical supplies were often more valuable than traditional plunder. A captured medicine chest might be worth thousands of pieces of 8 on the black market. Some pirate crews specialized in attacking ships known to carry medical supplies, selling them to colonial settlements where they were desperately needed. The presence or absence of a competent surgeon could determine a ship's success. Crews with good medical care could recover from battles and maintain strength through disease outbreaks. Conversely, ships with high mortality rates from poor medical care struggled to maintain crews. Some pirates invested their shares in medical training, spending time in colonial hospitals learning basic surgery. This investment could pay off enormously. A pirate with medical skills could demand higher shares, better treatment, and had options beyond piracy if needed. Several retired pirates became legitimate doctors in colonial towns, their past overlooked due to medical necessity. The end of the Golden Age. As the Golden Age of Piracy ended in the 1720s, the medical realities of pirate life played a significant role in its decline. Improved naval medicine meant that navy crews were healthier and more capable of extended pirate hunting voyages. Colonial authorities established hospitals in major ports, reducing pirates' advantage in local medical knowledge. The increasing organization of colonial medicine meant that pirates could no longer easily capture medical supplies. Medicines were better guarded, surgeons were reluctant to join pirate crews, and the black market for medical supplies was suppressed. Without access to proper medical care, pirate crews weakened and disbanded. Many pirates cited medical issues as reasons for accepting pardons. The promise of treatment for chronic conditions, dental care, and freedom from tropical diseases motivated many to abandon piracy. Colonial authorities sometimes offered medical care as an inducement for surrender, recognizing that disease and injury were pirates' greatest fears. The romanticization of pirate life in later centuries ignored these medical realities. The image of the hearty pirate with a peg leg and eye patch obscures the reality that most pirates with such injuries died quickly from infection. The few who survived did so despite their medical care, not because of it. Conclusion: the harsh reality of pirate life. As we've explored the mundane realities of pirate existence, the weevil-infested food, the democratic squabbles, and the horrific medical care, a picture emerges that's far removed from. The truth is that being a pirate was a desperate gamble with misery, where the promise of freedom and fortune had to be weighed against the near certainty of death from disease, starvation, or infected wounds. The diet of salt pork and hardtack that we've examined wasn't just unpleasant. It was a slow death sentence. Scurvy killed more pirates than all the naval battles combined. The weevils in their biscuits, which pirates learned to accept and even joke about, represent a level of degradation that modern people can barely comprehend. These men weren't eating insects by choice or for protein. They were so desperate that maggoty meats seemed acceptable. Yet understanding their diet helps us understand their motivations. When your daily meal is rancid pork and worm-filled bread, the chance to capture a merchant ship full of fresh provisions becomes worth risking your life. The feasts that followed successful raids weren't just celebrations. They were desperate attempts to consume enough nutrition to stave off deficiency diseases for a few more weeks. The democratic systems pirates created were remarkably progressive for their time, but they emerged from necessity, not ideology. Men who had suffered under the autocratic rule of naval captains and merchant masters created systems that protected them from similar abuse. Their codes and articles were social contracts written by people who understood that, without mutual agreement and fair treatment, their fragile societies would collapse. The medical realities we've explored are perhaps the most shocking. The image of a pirate with a peg leg and eye patch isn't romantic. It represents someone who survived traumatic amputation without anesthesia and lived with chronic pain every day after. Most pirates who lost limbs died within days from infection or shock. Those who survived did so through incredible luck and physical resilience, not because of any medical skill. The surgeons who treated them were victims of their own ignorance, trying desperately to help with tools and knowledge completely inadequate to the task. They sawed off limbs with carpenter's tools, treated tropical diseases they didn't understand, and watched most of their patients die despite their best efforts. The fact that any pirate survived these medical interventions is testament to human resilience rather than medical competence. What emerges from this examination is that pirates were neither romantic heroes nor simple villains. They were desperate men, and occasionally women who chose a terrible life because the alternatives seemed worse. They created democratic societies because autocracy had failed. They endured horrible food, disease, and medical care because the slim chance of wealth seemed worth the suffering. The boring parts of pirate life, the endless diet of preserved meat, the democratic debates over trivial matters, the agonizing medical procedures, were actually the defining features of the pirate experience. While battles and treasure hunts might have punctuated their existence, the daily reality was mundane misery, punctuated by terror. Understanding these realities helps us see pirates as they really were, not mythical figures, but human beings trying to survive in impossible circumstances. They created functioning societies under conditions that should have made organization impossible. They maintained hope despite daily evidence that they would likely die horrible deaths. They formed bonds of brotherhood while suffering from malnutrition and disease. The legacy of pirate democracy influenced later democratic movements, showing that even the most marginalized people could create fair governance systems. The medical knowledge gained from their suffering, particularly about scurvy and tropical diseases, eventually contributed to improvements in naval medicine. The economic systems they created presaged modern corporation structures with their share-based compensation and democratic governance. But perhaps the most important lesson from studying the mundane aspects of pirate life is about human nature itself. Even in the worst conditions, eating weevil-infested food, suffering from untreated diseases, facing brutal surgery without anesthesia, humans create societies, establish rules, and maintain hope. The pirates who voted on their articles while suffering from scurvy, who carefully divided plunder while missing limbs, who maintained their democratic principles while dying from tropical diseases, show us something profound about human resilience. The Golden Age of Piracy ended not with great naval battles or mass hangings, but with the slow grinding down of men who could no longer sustain the physical and psychological toll of their chosen life. Disease, malnutrition, and injury accomplished what navies couldn't: the elimination of piracy as a viable lifestyle. Today, when we romanticize pirates, we're really romanticizing the idea of freedom and rebellion against authority. But the reality was that this freedom came at a cost so high that most who chose it died within 3 years. The democratic principles they fought for were. The wealth they sought was usually consumed immediately in desperate attempts to forget their misery. The true story of pirate life is one of extremes. Extreme democracy in an age of autocracy. Extreme suffering in pursuit of wealth. Extreme medical ignorance in the face of tropical diseases. It's a story of men who created elaborate codes of conduct while living in conditions that would break most modern people within days. As we sit in our comfortable homes with our refrigerated food, modern medicine, and democratic rights, it's worth remembering the pirates who suffered through weevily biscuits, surgical amputations without anesthesia, and democratic debates while dying of scurvy. They were flawed, often violent, sometimes cruel, but ultimately human beings trying to create a better life in the only way they knew how. The boring parts of pirate life weren't really boring at all. They were desperate, tragic, and occasionally heroic attempts to maintain civilization in the most uncivilized conditions. Every meal of hardtack and salt pork, every democratic vote, every botched medical procedure was part of the larger story of humans refusing to surrender to circumstances, continuing to hope despite overwhelming evidence that hope was futile. That's the real legacy of the Golden Age of Piracy. Not the treasure or the battles, but the demonstration that even in the worst conditions, humans will create societies, establish justice systems, and maintain hope. The pirates who suffered through the mundane horrors we've explored tonight were testament to both the resilience and tragedy of the human condition. Their story reminds us that freedom has always come with a price, that democracy emerges from necessity as much as ideology, and that medical progress is built on the suffering of those who came before. The weevils in the hardtack, the democratic arguments over rum rations, and the screams from the surgeon's table were all part of the price these men paid for their brief taste of freedom. In the end, the boring parts of pirate life were anything but boring. They were the substance of existence for thousands of men who chose a brief, miserable freedom over a long, miserable servitude. Their legacy lives on not in buried treasure or romantic legends, but in the democratic principles they pioneered, the medical knowledge gained from their suffering, and the reminder that humans will endure almost anything for the chance at a better life.